Am I waiting for the slides? I was asked to wait for the slides before I introduce Randy. Oh, thank you. Okay. I want to reiterate, it's really weird with the empty tables. That's when you're standing here. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the conference, AODA, Enabling Innovation, presented by Randy Oldham and Adam Doan. We'd like to thank Renewed Computer Technology for their generous sponsorship of this session. Randy is the web development librarian and manager of the library's web team at the University of Guelph. As his title implies, Randy is a maker of websites, a customizer of web interfaces, and a user of Drupal. He is also a staunch supporter of accessibility and a strong believer in equal access. Adam is a systems developer at the University of Guelph Library. He's a coder, problem solver, and self-proclaimed techno wizard. He creates accessible, sustainable solutions for complex problems. Please join me in welcoming Randy and, in absentia, Adam.
It's like the surface of the sun up here. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to try to use these things, and I have lasers, so if you get out of hand, I will take care of that. So as I was already introduced, Adam is not here. You may have deduced on your own. But a couple of things about what he does. He works with the Atrium, which we have as an open journal systems, and DSpace. He's also created FoodMap, and we do a lot of stuff with Drupal, and we're just starting some work with Omeka. And I know HTML, CSS, Cold Fusion, and just enough JavaScript to be dangerous. Not like really dangerous, but dangerous to other people. So as you'll note, I have quite verbose slides. The reason for doing that is to improve the accessibility of this presentation. I tend to talk really fast, and so this way you can decipher what I'm saying. It's also so that these slides are useful after the fact. So if you see anything and you're trying to frantically write, don't worry. You can just pop me an email and I can send you the slides as well. So what I want to do first is, I know not everyone here is from Ontario, not everyone here works with the real down deep of websites, that you might be content providers or things like that. So I wanted to give a little bit of background into the AODA. If you're from another province, don't worry. I'm only going to do this little part at the beginning, and then the rest of it's going to be relevant to, I think, anyone. So first off, what is the AODA? Well, it stands for Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. It is provincial legislation that was launched in June of 2005 and became law then. And what it really does is it outlines mandatory accessibility standards to improve life for people with disabilities. So it doesn't do that just for websites. It's actually across a whole host of things like customer service, built environments, and things like that. I'm specifically going to be talking about the Integrated Accessibility Standard, one of them, which is the Information and Communication Standard. And that all has to do with how information is communicated to people. And what this legislation does is, instead of coming up with its own sort of standards and guidelines, it actually points to international guidelines, which is called WCAG 2.0 A and AA compliance. And this legislation says you have to have that compliance by certain dates. You might be wondering to yourself right now, Randy, what is WCAG? WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and we're working with version 2 here. So they did a version 1, completely redid it again for version 2. This, as I mentioned, was developed by the World Wide Web Consortia. These folks are the folks who create the standards which guide and govern the entire internets, all of the internets, every internet. They come up with the standards around HTML, XML, and also how your computers communicate on the internet. So they're sort of an international group that is not bound by any one sort of government or any one sort of region. So the take home that I want you to know is that this AODA legislation, instead of coming up with its own guidelines, is pointing to these worldwide standards. So as I mentioned, if you're not from the province of Ontario, this is still actually useful for you because it's about generally these international standards for creating accessible websites. So this legislation, a big date's coming up. Who's excited? January 1st. Yeah, Dan Scott's excited. All internet websites and web content must conform with WCAG 2.0 level AA, except where meeting the requirement is not practicable. This section applies to websites and web content, including web-based applications that an organization controls directly or through a contractual relationship that allows for modification of the product. So that means if you have your own ILS and you have access to it, and you can make customizations, perhaps you should. Also, to web content published on a website after January 1st, 2012. Who's scared right now? Raise of hands. just a general fear. Also, in determining whether meeting the requirements of this section is not practicable, remember they said that whole if it's not practicable thing, what does that mean? I guess everything. Organizations referenced in sections 1 and 2, those are institutions of higher ed, especially in government organizations, may consider, among other things, whether or not there are tools or software available to help you make things accessible, or if the timeline will be significantly impacted by doing this. So that was a whole lot of legalese. I still see some eyes, so I don't think I put anyone to sleep yet. But the take home is the legislation is real vague. There are very sweeping outs. That whole not practicable thing. Remember they said some things you should consider, but they don't say everything you should consider. So if you just don't feel like it, that could be not practicable. Also, I mentioned third-party systems. The level of access that you have to a third-party system also dictates whether or not you may be not able to make these customizations to make it comply. And there is also a proviso for archival and special collection resources, which is also quite vague. So all of these things, what I'd like to say, actually contribute to non-compliance or avoidance, especially for more complex types of content. Because a lot of people can say, okay, well, you know, I'm gonna do these more advanced user interface things, and it's just not practicable for me to make it accessible, so I won't. But what I want you guys to know, a couple of things I'm gonna show you, are that there are things that we do a lot of times, or we wanna do, that some people have been avoid putting on the web just because they think, I can't make this done in an accessible way. And I hope to show that you can. So how can we move forward and ensure compliance still? So we're gonna talk about how accessibility is often seen as a limiter to innovation, and how, as I mentioned, a lot of these Web 2.0 features can challenge accessibility compliance, and that people's default is typically to avoid or simplify, make things a lot more simple. But I'm suggesting to you, we can be compliant with AODA and still be innovative. So I'm gonna show a few common yet challenging types or bits of content, explain why they're a challenge according to the AODA, and then demo an AODA compliant workaround. These are gonna escalate in complexity. The last two that are in red, I'm not actually gonna talk about. Those were the ones that Adam, who is a lot more dangerous with JavaScript, was going to talk about. I'm gonna talk about the first four, but those are actually part of the slides, so if you are curious about those two things, do pop me an email and I can send those to you. So the first one I wanna talk about are web-based audio and video. So according to the legislation, captions are provided for all pre-recorded audio content in synchronized media, so if it's on a video or if it's pre-recorded audio, except when the media is a media alternative for text and is clearly labeled as such. Clear, right? It also goes on to say that an alternative for time-based media or audio description of the pre-recorded video content is provided for synchronized media, except when that media is a media alternative for text and is clearly labeled as such. Again, super clear. They try to make this legislation as accessible as possible. What that really means is that web-based video and audio must have a caption and a transcript. If it's audio only, it has to include a transcript, but if it's audio and video as well, it must have both. The interesting thing about having the transcript and captions is that this makes your content more accessible to those with visual impairments, audio impairments, but also learning disabilities. They're able to actually read along with the text as well, which can increase the learning of the video that they're watching. So types of content that we have in our libraries would include things like training videos, promotional videos, lecture capture, if your institution does lecture capture as well. Also video tutorials, here's how to place a hold with our catalog system, things like that. We often have the content around our websites. These are the types of things it would apply to. So what I've done is, a workaround for this is actually using YouTube captions. So has anyone went to YouTube and turned on the auto captions? A few hands in the air. How awesome was it? If it was 100% accurate, put your hand in the air. Okay, so for those who can't see, no one put their hand up. The legislation does require that the captions and transcript be 100% exactly what is being spoken by the audio track. So Automated captions are not compliant with AODA. But what you can do when you upload videos to YouTube is you can actually start from those subtitles that are auto-generated and make the corrections to them. So when I go to the next slide here, what you'll see is I made a really awesome 30-second clip, and I mentioned unicorns, Alan, in my clip. Is it actually shows you at the bottom of the screen, and you can correct them as you go. So it gives you a starting point, which can actually reduce the time it takes for you to make that video compliant with AODA. And then what you can do is once you have those captions created, it automatically generates a transcript for you based on what you've typed in. So it's really doing a 2-for-1 when you're putting those captions in. So you'll notice here, if you click on the more when you're watching the video, a transcript pops up. The problem with this transcript is that it is not available to screen readers, which sort of defeats the purpose for the legislation. But there's an interesting non-technical workaround that you can do. If you copy that transcript created by your captions and just paste it in the video description, it looks a little something like this. You can see my videos at the top. You can see the title of it is Test for Transcription, my smiling face below, and then just below that you can see where the description of the video is. That's where we pasted in the transcript. That is accessible to screen readers, also indexed by Google. So that means now your video content, the audio portion of that, all of it is now available through search as well. So that means if somebody is searching for catalog, place a hold, whatever your university name is, they're gonna get that hit for this video, where before they would not have. And these are the instructions on how to find that. Again, the slides are available after, let me know and I can send them to you. As I mentioned, searchable, which is a huge benefit. So we went through all of this effort to create an AODA compliant video using YouTube. We want to include it on our website, right? We have a course guide, maybe a lib guide that we want to embed this video into. So what we do is we head for that little embed code. Oh, the AODA is there. What the AODA says is that websites must be keyboard navigable. So it says all functionality of the content on the website must be operable through a keyboard interface. So how many people use the tab key to move around a website upon occasion? Some hands in the air, lots of people. Without requiring specific timings for individual keystrokes, like you don't have to do something at a specific time to make something happen, except where the underlying function requires input that depends on the path of a user's movement and not just the endpoints. Clear, right? If keyboard focus can be moved to a thing on the page using the keyboard, then focus can be moved away from that thing using only the keyboard interface. And if it requires more than unmodified arrow keys or the tab key, you have to do something special, slaughter a chicken, hit Control-Alt-Shift-F7, whatever, that the user is advised of that method and moving focus away. So what does that all mean? Web pages must be navigable by your keyboard. How many times have you tried to fill out a form and you're doing tab to get to the next field and it skips a field? It doesn't happen too often, but that's a really common way that you can see that it's broken and would not comply with AODA. But the general idea behind it is that if I can navigate to something using the keyboard control, I should be able to navigate out of it or away from it. So this really pertains to web forms, menu items as well, oftentimes. Also, embedded content can pose issues, such as embedded YouTube videos or Twitter widgets. So I have a little analogy for you. Imagine nested Tupperware just like this. So it's a beautiful rainbow celebrating diversity of Tupperware, or food storage containers, if you will. I did not pay for the trademark. So we have all of these Tupperware containers nested inside one another. For those of us who do not have a visual impairment, we can easily see whether the lid was on or off, that this is a Tupperware that contains Tupperware. It is meta Tupperware. Now imagine, if you will, that I took the innermost Tupperware, and let's say I didn't put blueberries in it. Let's say I put a delicious $1,000 bill. Anyone who has no visual impairment can immediately see this is Tupperware within Tupperware within Tupperware that eventually contains a $1,000 bill. And we'll rummage through opening all of them like one of those little Russian nesting dolls and get the $1,000 bill. Now imagine, if you will, that you have a visual impairment. Maybe you have low vision, maybe you have no vision at all. And you're presented with this Tupperware container. You probably feel immediately that you are holding a single Tupperware container. You may open that Tupperware container. You may find one inside of it. You may then open it again and find another and say, you know what, I'm good. I'm done with this. I don't know if there's blueberries or $1,000 bills in there, but I've had just enough. Right? So what we've done is we've actually caused a frustration for somebody who doesn't have a visual impairment by hiding that $1,000 bill inside of the Tupperware. I'm not suggesting you do that. But the same thing happens with a website. So here I've taken a screenshot of a website that shall remain unnamed. And it includes an embedded video at the bottom of it, of which I will also not name who is in the video. And that is actually embedded using an iframe, so using an embed code that you're probably all familiar with for things like YouTube and Twitter. But what essentially happens to someone who's using a screen reader is that embed code becomes a web page within a web page. So if they can tab to that embedded YouTube video, they get stuck in that YouTube video and they can't get back out of it. So they're essentially trapped within that inside website that's within a website. So that Tupperware container holding a $1,000 bill is within that other Tupperware container. They're trapped inside that Tupperware container. God, that sounds real bad. It's a big Tupperware container. So as I said, embedded YouTube can become a keyboard trap. One thing that a lot of places are doing in Ontario and around the world, and you probably didn't even realize this when you were clicking on a video, but they'll take a screen cap of the actual video with the play button showing and make that a link that takes them to the actual video within YouTube. Now the nice thing about that is then it displays the transcription information that we talked about earlier, and the captions are already there anyways, but then you're also getting all of the metrics that are stored by YouTube as well. So this is a very, very low-tech way. You just take a screen cap of that video playing, post that in your website instead of the embed code, and link out to the video. So again, I'm not promising any sort of technical wizardry here. Anyone can do it. And the only thing to remember is don't forget an alt tag on that image to make sure that it's compliant with AODA. So you're saying, hey, this is a link to blah video, so they know where they're gonna go. So as I mentioned, very simple way to include a link to a YouTube video that looks embedded but is guaranteed AODA compliant. I made guaranteed AODA compliant in very capital letters because as of 3 weeks ago, YouTube did make a change to the embed code, and you can actually tab to a video and tab out of it now. So right now, YouTube videos, if embedded, are compliant, but they can make changes to that code at any time, which makes it non-compliant. So again, if you want to be sure you're always compliant, you might want to do the method that I showed you as opposed to relying on them. Another thing to talk about here, tables. So tables need a little bit of extra care and feeding to make them compliant with the AODA. The legislation says that information, structure, and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available in text. As always, it's super clear, but what we have to remember is that tables don't just present information. It's not just a paragraph of text. They present that information in a way that includes the informational relationships in a visual way. So we're getting the information, and we're also getting the relationships between bits of information. So I have a really simple chart. You'll have to trust me that Adam's hair is brown and his eyes are hazel. But this is just a really simple table to explain my point. So the information, Randy blonde green, on its own does not make a whole lot of sense. But if you know the headers, name, hair color, eye color, makes a little bit more sense. But then you can also actually compare my information to anyone else within that table. So my simple table, you can compare Adam to myself. That becomes a little bit harder when you're trying to make a table accessible with AODA, and if you have a visual impairment. So you can make tables accessible, but it does require a considerable amount of HTML knowledge. How many people are fluent in the HTMLs? Fair few number of hands, good for you. The more complex the table, so if you have a table with nested headings, obviously the more complex the table gets, the more inaccessible it becomes. And one thing to always remember is that a table summary is necessary. So basically, everything that you have in that table, you also need to reproduce in the table summary, which sort of makes the table unnecessary. And I like to say that even if you are to make a table accessible, it is still a nightmare for a screen reader. Because what a screen reader does is it reads the item in the table, and it reads the header and column that it is in as well for every single cell in that table. So you can imagine as that table grows and grows and grows, if there's 5 rows in it, it becomes very complex to be read by a screen reader. And I would say even though you might be meeting the AODA requirements, you're not actually making it accessible to people who need it. So I suggest thinking about alternative formats. So one example that I have are calendars. So we often use calendars in our websites. They really are just big old tables. We use them typically for things like events or workshops or hours. These, as I mentioned, any table can be a pain for a screen reader. But this is really a case for content management systems. How many of you are running a content management system at institution now, like WordPress, Drupal, something like that. So the great thing about using a content management system is once you have that information in there in a calendar view, you can rather easily change that so it can output in a different view. You've already got the exact same content, you're just showing it in a different way. So we have one view of the events and workshops on a calendar, and then we can take the exact same bit of information and we can present it in a list view. It's the same content, as I mentioned, just different views. So I have a quick little demo here. We have an event calendar on our website. You can see at the top, it's got the calendar information, the month, and so on. It's got the days of the week at the top. We have another column. We have another row, pardon me, of the weeks of the year, and then we have actual events there. So for a screen reader, for us to label each of those headings appropriately becomes quite onerous and very difficult for them to listen to in a screen reader. So what we do is at the very top, before they even get to that table, we provide them a link that takes them to a list of items, and it's the exact same content, just in a list view. So now instead of being presented in this table where we have to worry about all of those headings and labeling them appropriately and still coming up with something that sounds like a satanic verse when listened to with a screen reader, what we do instead is we just present it in a way that is much more simplified. And again, this isn't only useful for those who have a visual impairment. This can also be a godsend for those with learning disabilities for whom that visual representation of information might not be a good way for them to digest it. So again, at the very top of this page, if they happened upon it accidentally, they can click back to a calendar view quickly. And all of that same information you saw before in the calendar, actually a little more, because we have the starting of the description, is available right here. So it's an alternative format of the same information. It displays upcoming events from today onward. So it doesn't show those past events that you can see in a calendar view, but most people don't care about events that have already passed, which is why we start from today onward. It is much more screen reader friendly, and as I mentioned, it's learning disability friendly as well. The last part I want to talk about is enabling transcription. So the AODA says that all non-text content that is presented to the user must have a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose, except for the situations listed below, which we're not going to talk about, but trust me. We're from the library, so oftentimes we have digitization projects for things like digital humanities, where we're scanning in bits of content, pages of old texts, diaries, things like this, making them available on the web. Now remember before I mentioned that there is an archival resource exemption. So what we really could do is we could say, you know what? I don't have to make this accessible because it's archival. And that may sound like a bit of a godsend. The problem is, don't forget that it's not only making that content inaccessible to people who have a visual disability, but it's also not available for full text searching either. I have an example for you. So one project that we're working on at the University of Guelph is we have a huge collection of farm diaries. So oftentimes in the olden times, men were working the farms, women were at home, and they were blogging, essentially, in old school times, blogging in their farm diaries about what was going on with the farm, the surrounding families they were interacting with, and that's a rich source of information about what life was like during that time. So what we're doing is we're taking all of these handwritten diaries, and we're scanning those in and making those images available. So again, we could have said, you know what, this is an archival resource, nay, we need not make it accessible. And because, as I mentioned, they're handwritten, we can't really run it through OCR. I mean, it's hard enough to read with the human eye, let alone with a computer eye. And I had laser eye surgery, so I know all about this. So can we invoke that archival resource exemption? Well, we can, but that's not really doing us any good, and it's certainly not helping our patrons either. So one thing that you can do is, here's an example of a scanned-in picture. And what we find with a lot of these is that the spelling is often not amazing. The quality of the pages, not amazing as well, so our scans reflect that. We're using a system called Omeka. Anyone heard of Omeka? Lots of hands, awesome. So one of the things you can do with Omeka is you can scan this stuff, put it up, make it available to people, amazing. But Omeka also has plugins that you can use, one of which is to allow crowdsourcing transcription. So what that allows you to do is essentially embed the transcription box on the page that you've scanned in, and then people can actually provide transcriptions for you on the fly. So that's an interesting way of saying, you know what, instead of saying we're not going to make this comply with the AODA because we don't have to, we're enabling people to actually provide that transcription service for us. And then if we do get a request from somebody, because we are required by the legislation to satisfy requests to make things accessible, we have the capability built into the system already to do that. So everything you see on this page right now is Omeka. What I'm suggesting is if you don't have Omeka running at your institution, but you have content similar to this, that you can actually put a link on each one of those pages to a web form which captures the referring URL and provide a box for crowdsourced transcription. So they're doing the exact same thing, just the system's not managing it, you are. You could also do something similar where you have a link to request a copy of this, a transcribed copy of this, and then people click it and you can then receive those requests and submit them, writing back the transcript to the page. So there's a lot of different ways. The goal here is what I'm trying to say. There's a lot of different ways to make things as compliant as you can, and if not, enable the platform to allow it with not a lot of technical expertise. This one has a little bit more workflow on the back end. Someone has to be responding to those. But you could even repurpose things like comments on a page. So if you have a page that you have scanned in text, at the bottom you can include the regular old comments that a lot of the content management systems provide, rename it to transcription, and allow people to post those back. Or even a wiki form. You have your picture at the top, a wiki at the bottom. People can edit that to provide the transcript for you as well. So there's lots of various options to enable us to meet the AODA requirements, which enables us to allow for greater compliance. In summary, what I suggest is be creative. It's not often about completely disregarding content types that we think might be a little bit more complex to deal with because of the legislation or because we want our website to be accessible to as many people as possible. If we think outside the box a little bit, we can repurpose some of the things that we already do to make these things more compliant. Work with open source as much as you can. It allows you to leverage the resources you're already using. Like I mentioned, a simple comment form field can automatically or can be transformed into allowing feedback and transcriptions from users. A few links to the WCAG resources, and the quick reference is very helpful. And don't forget to be friendly and specific and share anything that you find. Where a lot of us are struggling with in Ontario, trying to make sure we meet compliance by that exciting January 1st deadline. And even if you're not within Ontario, like I said, having an accessible website is a good thing. So by all means, share with colleagues as much as you can. That's it for me. Email address there at the very bottom, roldham@uoguelph.ca. You can pop me an email if you do want a copy of the slides. As I mentioned, I do have more secret slides after here that I did not talk about, but we do talk about how to make maps more accessible and how to make a language tool selection box within Open Journal System accessible as well. That's it for me, folks. Oh. And I think I have a few moments for questions. Yes, I got a nod. At the back, sir. Was someone else repeating the question, or shall I? I shall. Oh, I got it. I got a mic right here. So the question was, what's my familiarity with various online self-auditing tools for website compliance? So one that I use is I literally just searched WCAG validator, I think is what it is. And there's one out of Saskatchewan. I can't even remember what it's called. Someone help me out here. Cricket. We also have a product on campus called Site Improve, which our campus provides, which automatically searches every website within. Does anyone else have that? I heard some murmurings. Yep, some hands. So what that does is it actually scans your entire website and looks for compliance. The important thing to remember is that just using a compliance testing tool does not necessarily mean that if you get check marks and thumbs up, that you're 100% compliant. A lot of times it'll disregard things like JavaScript, embedded videos and things like that. It's like, hey, this exists on the page. I can't tell what it is, so you should check it out. So we'll flag some of those for you. The other one that I've used before is Wave. It's W-A-V-E. Wave also will sort of show you your website with an overlay showing you where some issues may be. That can be helpful, but my recommendation is use as many different testing methods as you possibly can, because they don't all catch the same things. And it only goes so far. You really do have to look at the code and sort of be semi-familiar with the legislation, which is where those decipherings came from. That was a great question. Any other questions? Yes. Right. Yeah, so the question is, what about crowd-provided resources? So for example, we have DSpace, and so our students upload their theses, digital versions of their theses, to our repository. So that is made available on the web. Now, the interesting thing is the content provider in that regard, we're using a third-party system, OJS, although we do have access to it. Sorry, not OJS, DSpace. We do have access to the back end, so we do as much as we possibly can to make the interface as accessible as we can. We are working into it, sort of training that's available to people to know how to make an accessible PDF, but ultimately the content provider is responsible for ensuring compliance with the legislation. It's a very good question and a very touchy one right now. I know that we're dealing with in the library at Guelph. So over and above saying do whatever you can to the interface that they're sending that information in on, educating the people who can provide that content if it's possible, like if it's a small subset of people, but it's a tricky one. And I think you have to sort of do it in a way. I know one thing that we do is we require them to say, like, they have copyright clearance to submit that to us. So as part of our thesis thing, they say, yeah, I own this, here it is, I guarantee that this is copyright cleared, is that we may have some sort of proviso there as well to say, you know, and I guarantee that my work is AODA compliant. And then if it's not, then they can go back to that individual and say, hey, you need to make this compliant. But it's definitely a difficult question. How are you guys receiving content? Okay. So then anyone could just go in, start up a blog, and then go ahead and create. Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I mean, that's a hard one. You could say before they create the blog, if there's any sort of process there for registering, just sort of provide some guidelines. But yeah, it's a difficult one. Any other questions? That's it. That's it. Thank you so much, everybody. As I mentioned, if you have any questions or want a copy of the slides, please feel free to email me, roldham@uoguelph.ca. Thanks, guys.